what you're about to see is the steps that you need to build a tiny house, which is a really important lesson. It's really easy to get confused and mix up the steps, and it can make it a way more expensive and time-consuming endeavor. If you like this, I hope that you will click the link below for our free class, the top 10 ways to save on building a tiny house. No matter what you're building, it's incredibly valuable. There is a lot that goes into building a building. And so we're going to be walking through step by step the order of operations that you should follow when you go to build a building. And we're doing this thinking mostly about like somewhat conventional buildings or tiny houses that are stick framed, but natural buildings will mostly follow the same order, although there will be some variations. Like there might be a situation like if you're building a cob building in a wet climate, you might choose to use posts and put the roof on before you build up the wall systems. But generally, this is the order that you should follow. So the very first thing that you're going to do is observe the site. So observation and figuring out what style of building is going to make the most sense on that site. And then you're going to work with design. So you're going to be designing your building. It's best to design your building before you start your building. You might tweak the design a little bit as you go, which sometimes is inevitable, but you want to have a basic idea and design before you get started. Next, you're going to do site work. So if there's any earth moving that needs to be done, whether that's with machinery, heavy machinery, or whether it's by hand, you want to do it before you get started. I've seen people like go ahead and build a post foundation and then be like, oh my gosh, I could have all this space for storage under my house if only it was dug out. But then you're digging out in this like very uncomfortable place and position. So way better to do that site work before you get started. And then the next thing that you're going to do is build the foundation. And there's lots of different types of foundations that I'm sure you have really learned from the foundation class that we offer as part of this course. So there's lots of different types of foundations, but you want to start with the foundation. That's very important. And then you're going to do the floor system after you do the foundation, and then the subfloor on top of the floor system. Then you're going to be doing wall framing. And in this case, you're going to be doing stick framing. These are studs. And so you're going to be framing your wall. And while you're framing your wall, you will usually put the sheathing on your wall before you erect your walls. And so this is what we're going to be doing during our tiny house class. Now, that's not what you're going to be doing if you're doing one of these naturally built wall systems that is another class in this course, but somewhere around here, you're going to be erecting some sort of wall situation that is going to be holding up your roof. And then you're going to be building your roof. And so your roof might be rafters, made up of rafters with rafter blocking, or it might be made up of a truss system, which is usually you purchase trusses, but you can also make them yourselves. And trusses can make a lot of sense for gabled roofs, and they use smaller materials to be able to span a larger amount using the glory of triangles. And then after you put up your rafters or your trusses and blocking, if you have it, then you're going to be doing your purlins or roof sheathing. So it just depends on what type of roof you're building, is whether you want to do purlins or roof sheathing. And most houses nowadays tend to do sheathing, either with boards or more often with some sort of sheet good like plywood. But in barns and sheds, some sheds and old-timey houses, it's often done with purlins, and you block in between those purlins if you, like on the edges of the building, if you're using purlins. And then you're going to be putting on your roof metal or whatever roofing you might be using. Most of you, if you're going to be building a house, I imagine are going to use some type of roof metal, but you might be using something else, like I said. And we have this wonderful class about roofs, which Danielle teaches, so make sure to check that out. It's part of the course. And then after the roofing metal, then you're going to install your windows and your doors. And when you get to that point, you are going to be in such a state of bliss because you have now gotten your building dried in. And so getting your building to this point is really less than half the work, but it feels really, really gratifying to get it dried in. And it means that the building's at a point where you can take a rest and stop and regroup or make some money to be able to finish the rest of your building. Then comes the exterior of the building. So you can choose to do the exterior of the building, finish it up before you finish the interior of the building. And that might be better for the lifespan of your building because you don't want your sheathing to be sitting around uncovered for too long, because that can cause it to degrade, and then once it gets covered up, it's not going to be last as long, and probably the adhesives that are holding it together, because sheathing is usually some sort of sheet material that has adhesives holding together some wood parts, which might be sheets of wood or they might be chunks of wood, and so or strands of wood. And so whatever the case is, the sooner you cover your sheathing, the better. But usually people tend to finish the interiors of their buildings before the exteriors of their buildings because they're paying rent somewhere and they just want to move into their house. And so it's normal to finish the exterior of an owner-built building last, but just don't let it take too long. So the first thing that you're going to be doing on the exterior of your building is you're going to be finishing off your fascia and your soffit. If you're doing a fascia and soffit, you could also just have rafter blocking between your rafters and have venting through that blocking, but doing a fascia and soffit is going to make that part of your building last much longer, because if you have exposed rafters and they get buggy, that can be really bad for your building. So I didn't always do fascias and soffits, but now I do, and I think it's a good idea, unless it's just like a shed. Then after you do your fascia and soffit, then you get to your siding and your exterior trim. And depending on what kind of siding you're doing, you might be doing your exterior trim before you do your siding. If you're doing some sort of horizontal siding, then that's how you do it. But if you're doing some other types of siding, then it can make sense to do your siding before your trim. So it just depends on what type you're doing. And then come gutters, and I highly recommend gutters because the gutters are going to keep your building dry, especially if you have a roof slope that's sloping uphill. It's going to keep water from getting into the foundation of your building, and that is really important for the lifespan of your building. It can also be really good for your landscaping, and gutters, and it's great because then you can catch that water in some sort of cistern or catchment system. Rather than just the water being a problem, then the water is like an awesome solution. And then finally comes landscaping. So it really doesn't make sense to do the landscaping on your building until your building is totally done, because all of this putting on siding and putting up ladders to put your gutters on and all this stuff, it's going to be messing with the ground, and better to wait to install any landscaping until after you have completed the outside of your building. So good luck with building your building. I'm sure it's going to go awesome. And if you follow this order, things will go a lot smoother. So you've got your building dried in. Congratulations. It's pretty awesome. So you have some choices at this point. So most people that I know, when they get to this point, they start working on the interior of their building because they have some pressure that they really need to move in. And it's really important to get the interior totally finished before you move in. I've seen so many people move in like when there's insulation on the walls but not paneling, or when there's paneling up but there's no trim. And if you do that, the likelihood of you finishing the inside and living in a structure that you really enjoy being in is much lower. So make sure, if you can possibly follow my advice, to finish the interior completely before you move in. I think you will be way happy to have done that. So at this point, you can either finish the interior or you can finish the exterior. In some ways, finishing the exterior before you finish the interior is better for the structure of your building, because you don't want your zip system or whatever type of sheathing you're using for your building, you don't want it to be out in the sun forever. Like, it's rated to be out and exposed to the sun for a certain amount of time, so that the building can be built like in phases and there's no stress to get the siding on. But really, you need to get siding on and you need to get exterior trim. So make sure to not let that last too long. I've been guilty, and I know a lot of people who've been guilty of leaving up their sheathing uncovered for multiple years, and that is not good for the lifespan of your building. So moving on to the interior of your building. So the first thing that you're going to do with the interior is duct work. So if you are installing some sort of HVAC system in your building, then you want to install that first. If you're doing a mini split unit, that is the exception, because then you don't need to do duct work. But oftentimes houses need duct work. That's the thing you do first, because the duct work is so big. You want to make sure to do the do any sort of work, whether it be duct work, electrical, or plumbing. You want to do the big stuff before you do the small stuff, because it's much easier to move the small stuff around the big stuff than the big stuff around the small stuff. So we start with duct work, and then you're going to go to plumbing. And with all of these interior things, even if you're an owner builder, you might choose to find a subcontractor for some of them, because there are people who are really good at these things that do them over and over and over again and do them really well and carefully. And a lot of this stuff, the ductwork, the plumbing, and the electrical, it's going to be at points buried in the walls. So if you screw it up, it's going to be really hard to fix it later. So if you can hire a professional, I think it's probably a good idea. So the ductwork, and then the plumbing, because the plumbing is the next biggest thing. And so the plumbing's done. And if you're getting your house inspected, they're going to do inspections of these different things. And this is the order that they're going to want them done. So then there's the plumbing in and the plumbing out, which we have a whole class about. And then you're going to do the electrical. And again, we have a class where we cover that, but I really advise getting a licensed electrician to do your electrical, because that's one place where you can burn down your house if you screw up your electrical, and it can be extremely dangerous. So if you're going to hire one thing out, that's the thing I would hire out. And then after you get your electrical in, then you can fill your wall cavities with insulation. And if you're doing a naturally built house, there's going to be some tweaking of all of these things. Like for a slip straw house, for example, you're going to be putting in your studs, you're going to do your electrical, your plumbing, your duct work. And then when I say insulation, that's when you're actually doing your slip straw wall. And so your house won't be dried in until that point. But that's just a very specific thing for the for doing slip straw. You could also just make your slip straw wall, and then you can run conduit on the outside of your slip straw. And that's what I've done with my log cabin. Conduit makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. So anyway, if you're doing a naturally built building, this order is a little different, and there are changes to it. And then after you do your insulation of your walls and your ceiling, and hopefully your floor is already insulated, then you are going to do your ceiling paneling. And that ceiling paneling might be wood, or it might be drywall. And then after you do your ceiling paneling, you're going to do paint. And so it's nice to do the paint before you put your final floor in, when you still have a subfloor. So that is like really convenient. And then after you do your painting, then you're going to do your flooring. And after your flooring, that's when you put in your fixtures, like your light fixtures, like the wall plates for your outlets, and the little the guts of the outlet themselves. And you're going to be doing cabinets, and you're going to be putting in toilets, sinks, all these things. And then finally, for the interior, is your interior trim. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that was enlightening, because I've seen a lot of people do the steps in the wrong order, and that can make a big problem and make things way more expensive. If you like this, I hope that you will click the link below for our free class, The Top 10 Ways to Save on Building a Tiny House.